Thank you. We're so happy to be here. I'm Susan Dudley. I'm the founder of the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center and a professor of public policy there. I'm also on Norm AI's Regulatory Advisory Committee. And one of my claim to fame is I'm the former head of the office that reviews all the regulations of the federal government, as John likes to call it, the White House regulatory czar. And I'm here with a man who needs no introduction, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to introduce him. Senator Phil Gramm has had a very distinguished career as an economics professor, congressman, elected as both a Democrat and as a Republican, a senator, chair of the banking committee, author of lots of bipartisan regulation that bears his name, like Graham Leach Bliley, a banker, and now a regular Wall Street Journal contributor and a book author. So in part, I wanted to talk to him about his new book, which I finished reading and loved.
You can buy it on Amazon.
Buy it on Amazon. I think there may be some copies here. Bryn will let me know, I'm sure. The Triumph of Economic Freedom, which basically busts 7 myths. And actually, I noticed that Larry Summers has a blurb in your book. I think quite a bit is relevant to AI and what we're talking about today. So let me just start shooting some questions at you. So first, from the 10,000 foot level, we hear a lot that AI is so different, so revolutionary and transformative that our past experience really doesn't help us, and that we need to think about new ways of approaching regulatory policy to get ahead of this. I think your book suggests that the past is still useful, and that even though this is transformative, we can learn a lot from the Industrial Revolution.
We don't know anything except the past. People that are talking about the future are talking through their hat. I think there are 2 historic periods that are very important today. One is the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is the most dramatic change that has ever happened in human history. And so maybe AI is going to be more transformative than the Industrial Revolution, but you got to have a better imagination than I have to believe that. The Industrial Revolution ended 1,000 years of stagnation, started growth at levels that were of biblical proportions, and the growth has never ended. In the United States, GDP tripled in 30 years, population doubled, wages in real terms rose by 160%, agricultural production doubled, mining and manufacturing production rose 7-fold. So it was a pretty dramatic change. And I think if you look at what happened in the Industrial Revolution, in a period where the population was literally exploding, 20 million people came to America between 1870 and 1900 looking for opportunity and freedom, and found both. And this was during the period of the Industrial Revolution. So obviously, the Industrial Revolution, the most dramatic change in human history, did not destroy jobs. It created jobs at a rate unprecedented in the history of mankind, and prosperity. And I think that's encouraging in looking at the future. And it did it in a period where population was really growing. We're now in a period where population is relatively stagnant. I think the second period that's important historically is the last 50 years. I mean, we talk about change without recognizing how much change is occurring in the American economy. Every month, 5 million people are either fired or quit their job. 5 million people a month. And fortunately for America, about 5.4 million people take new jobs. And so there is a tremendous amount of flexibility in the American economy. And during those 50 years, we've had the personal computer, we've had the internet, we've had the iPhone, and yet employment in America has continued to grow. So if you want to bet that AI is going to destroy jobs and in the process leave people without productive activity, you can place that bet, but I'm not going to place that bet. Now, there are also other lessons that I think are very important. In the Industrial Revolution, we had a wave of creative destruction. And the creative part was this massive growth in the ability to produce. As Karl Marx said, the productive capacity unleashed by the Industrial Revolution was greater than the productive capacity produced under all other periods in world history. It all happened in 100 years. And basically, the productive part of the wave created the world we live in. But there was also, since it was a wave of creative destruction, the destruction part had a profound political effect. If you read the history of the Industrial Revolution, even in the best-selling high school and college textbooks today, 200 years later, it is highly colored by writing responding to the destructive part of the Industrial Revolution. It destroyed the system of patronage and basically bondage. It destroyed the guild system. It destroyed the cottage industries that covered up Britain and the United States. And the literature that was written about the period, oh God, that bread should be so dear and flesh and blood so cheap. Arnold Toynbee, one of the great historians of the 19th century, wrote that the Industrial Revolution was the worst period in the history of Britain. In the National Archives today, if you go into, the portrait gallery, you've got the portrait in one room of all the great industrialists in America. And you have a picture of a guy named Henry George, who was a political writer, not really an economist. And you have his famous quote, "In the Industrial Revolution, the rich got richer, the poor became hopeless, and the middle class was blown away." Complete, utter falsehood at variance with every available fact that exists in terms of the history of the 19th century. Now, where did that come from? Why is it still being taught in public colleges and universities and private colleges and universities? Because of the political reaction to the destructive part of the Industrial Revolution. If Britain had had, and if America had had the government then we have today, the Industrial Revolution would have gone very differently. And so I think there's a lesson there that you're about to see a real wave of negative debate, public opinion movement, and potential political movement in response to, don't forget, the Industrial Revolution started with the destruction of industrial equipment by the Luddites that was so pervasive in Britain that the Parliament imposed a death penalty for destroying technical equipment, industrial equipment. There's also a lesson from the last 50 years, and I'll stop on this subject. The last 50 years, we have tried to deal with the negative part of creative destruction. There have been two big experiments, a trade adjustment assistance program. President Kennedy was a committed free trader. There was no way that he was going to oppose protectionism, but he had pressure from the union, so he created trade adjustment assistance. In our entire experience with it, people who benefited from it were unemployed longer and entered the labor force at a lower level. It was a complete and absolute failure. Extended unemployment basically proved to be a very negative factor because people who got the benefit longer stayed unemployed longer and their skills deteriorated. So every writing on this subject is now talking about government programs to deal with unemployment, when the two programs the last 50 years that have dealt with unemployment have been an absolute failure. So as I shouted out to our White House advisor First, do no harm. Give Bill Clinton great credit for the fact that when the internet came in, his policy was, in dealing with our newest technology, let's apply our oldest value. First, do no harm.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a couple of things this highlights for me. One is that the book really is very empirical. So the data and statistics that you've heard, that's through the book with nice graphics and clear prose. But the other is that we are hearing about the destruction part. There's a lot of concern. So I actually asked, I think it was Copilot, what are the biggest policy concerns about AI? And you've already addressed jobs. Another big one is there are these big dominant firms and that we need to do something to regulate them. Now, you and I are old enough to remember that really was the main type of regulation in the last century, and that the very regulation aimed at protecting against monopolies ended up harming the consumers and the workers and benefiting the monopolies. And so in your book, you write about, I guess it's 50 years ago now, in the Carter administration and beyond, efforts to deregulate.
First of all, in terms of jobs, you got to remember that you've all heard the term American exceptionalism. Well, American exceptionalism is that we have had more rapid growth, we have higher incomes, our economy is more efficient. Part of that is the creative part of the wave of creative destruction is higher because we generate technology. But of equal importance, we let markets work. In Europe, it's hard to hire people because it's difficult and expensive to fire people. And if you don't let the process adjust, where the industries that are made obsolete go out of business and people move back into the labor market into areas with higher value, you stunt your growth. And that's a big factor as we look at the future. In terms of antitrust, there's a lot of discussion about it now. And there really have been historically two views of antitrust. One is big is bad. Unfortunately, in the world we live in with technology, that approach is going to be very, very destructive. We tried it for 70 years on the view that big was bad. It was an absolute failure. Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy led the effort to overturn it. And we now dominate the world in the areas they deregulated. The cost of moving people and things is half today in real terms what it was when we deregulated in the late 1970s. And our second approach to antitrust, which I think is the correct approach, if size is generated by efficiency and innovation, then let the market work. If size creates the capacity and you actually have monopolistic behavior where people limit production to drive up price and hurt consumers, then you regulate and you engage in antitrust activity. I think that's the lessons of the last 100 years. Unfortunately, you had in the Biden administration a strong element of big is bad. And you have, unfortunately, in the Federal Trade Commission, even under President Trump, you have this idea that you can use antitrust legislation to deal with other issues like bias in the media. Well, antitrust legislation is to protect the consumer. It's not about ESG or media bias. That's Congress's job. So I think, again, we should follow the things that have worked in the last 100 years. But I see this as a real threat.
I do too. I mean, I think we've got modern day populists on both sides that are urging us to go back to what we learned was harmful to the very people we're supposed to protect. So another thing that Copilot told me was the digital divide and income inequality is a big concern. Got thoughts on that?
Yeah, listen, it's always a concern. If you'll remember in the Gilded Age, there was even though we had experienced the most rapid growth and prosperity in the history of mankind on this earth for the previous 30 years, there was so much obsession. In 1892, there were 4,050 millionaires in America. And the progressives were so focused on those 4,050 people that they turned a blind eye to the 77 million people who had experienced more growth than any people in the history of the world. And I think you just got to accept the fact that in the market we're in now, where you can invent a product and it can sell on the world market almost instantly, that somebody can become a billionaire. But are we poorer because they're richer? And secondly, do we benefit from their riches? I had a guy from TIAA-CREF sitting at my table, and the perfect example of how I have benefited from Elon Musk and Bill Gates. My wife paid into TIAA-CREF as a college professor and economist for 9 years. And then when we went to Washington, she worked for the Institute for Defense Analysis and paid into TIAA-CREF with a salary of about $55,000 a year. That TIAA-CREF today is worth $2.2 million. Why? Because of the very people that we read about every day that people are envious of how much money they made. Well, appreciate the fact that they created wealth that made me wealthier. And if you'll look at your own experience, you will find that. So, and also, if you adjust for taxes and for welfare benefits, income inequality is less today than it was in 1947.
I found that really
powerful. And I show that in the book.
Yeah, I found that powerful. So we only
and I agree with, I don't know who said it today, but I'd be willing to bet good money that AI hits brains before it hits muscles.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
I would bet good money that you're going to see it affect the higher income people first. As I'm always telling my grandchildren, pay attention to the world, why people act as they do, why they think as they do. The money in the future is going to be walking around sense, not book sense. Hell, the machines are going to do the book sense.
Well, that wraps
It's just
up our
grandpa
time.
talking. But.
Well, I think we can all learn from the wisdom. And so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for promoting my book.